disease and what we could know about it by measuring things and studying it. When I was first in the field, we knew that visual field loss happened, and people probably had a good idea that it was something in the retina, the retinal ganglion cells that were dying. I mean, we knew that was true, but we hadn't seized on that and said, well, what are the implications of that? What are the clinical features of this disease that we could study in the lab and begin working with in animal models? So first Doug Gasterlin and Carl Kupfer produced high pressure in monkeys, and some of us took the ball and ran with that, and it's sequentially gone right down the line with models now in mice, so that we can use genetic things and do gene therapy experiments in rats and mice that show here is the direction neuroprotection is likely to go. Here are several candidates that have come out of these animal models of pressure in the laboratory. But we wouldn't have done that if we hadn't been trying to produce something to say, well, it looks this way in a human. Can we duplicate that in an animal in such a way that we can explain what does cupping look like? Why, if I was taught that the cup got bigger before the field test became abnormal because glial cells were dying. Well, we studied how many glial cells there were, and there weren't enough glial cells to explain the cup getting bigger. Mm-hmm. So I think trying to put what all of us as glaucoma doctors do and see every day on patients, and then give some sort of rational explanation for it and make that meaningful in terms of what we're doing to treat patients. That's kind of the general approach to a lot of things. One of the fun things that I do, and I have to stress that it's not that it's so important what you do that's important, it's whether it's fun to do it, is to see things going on in patients and to say someone has to figure out how to explain that and make sense of it in a way that we can treat patients better. And one of my favorite examples is in doing cataract surgery. I got so frustrated with how many of our patients, especially with angle closure, had this thing positive pressure. They were trying to shove their iris and lens out of the eye. And it was after they had an iridotomy. So there couldn't still be pupillary block. There had to be these other phenomena going on inside the eye. It had to be something to do with the iris and maybe the choroid and vitreous, the idea that malignant glaucoma was happening because aqueous was being misdirected to the back of the eye didn't make any sense. So what I've liked to do and what I've really enjoyed doing is trying to look at what we see clinically on patients and then try to think up mechanisms that explain that and then go test those. And what it takes is to put new technology to it, to either use the technology that's there or to say to somebody who can do those technological things, here is what we really need. We need an instrument that's going to show us the movements of the pupil with an anterior segment optical coherence tomography thing. And to get a Mike Patella, who was at Zeiss at the time, to build a breadboard prototype machine that would do that, now it's a commercial instrument. Those sorts of things, to take something from the clinical observation that here's our problem to mechanistic explanations to, well, that's how we're going to predict who needs an iridotomy now, is to use that instrument to measure those things. So I would think those are things that have been the most fun.
And then you've also gotten into public health with your career, and how does that kind of tie in?
I backdoored into it because I mentioned Al Sommer already. Al was doing this Baltimore Eye Survey, the original prevalence study that was looking at the rates of glaucoma among African-derived and European-derived Americans. And he needed an ophthalmologist to examine people and say, well, this one has glaucoma and that one doesn't have glaucoma. At that time, we all believed there was a thing called low-tension glaucoma. And Dr. Malmany had said, well, that doesn't exist. There is no such thing. Now, by that, he meant that none of these people really had glaucoma with normal pressure. They really had high pressures, you just hadn't caught them at it. We saw person after person with normal pressure and glaucoma, and they weren't being treated. So it became obvious that this was, in fact, glaucoma, and I began learning that you had to get outside the clinic in order to understand this disease, because if all you see are the patients who present themselves to you, you have ascertainment bias, as you epidemiologists, true credentials would say. And so I said, okay, I guess we have to get outside the clinic more, not just be the ophthalmologist for this study. As it happened, Al became the dean of the School of Public Health. Our group at the Dana Center needed somebody who could turn the lights on in the morning and make sure that everybody showed up for work. And they said, you be the head of this group. And I didn't have the credentials to do that. So we started doing studies. And Sheila West convinced me that we really needed to do something for adults in Tanzania, that she was working with trachoma. It was mostly with kids. I said, I really want to find out what's glaucoma like among villagers in Tanzania. So we began designing some work in that realm. And finally it came about because, having realized we wouldn't understand the disease till we saw what it was like in the population, I began asking questions like, how long does the average glaucoma patient have glaucoma? And how many of them are there out there? How many people have glaucoma in the world? How fast does it progress? And all of that was not going to be able to be answered by clinical data very well at all. And some of it could only partially be answered by population-based data. You had to do mathematical modeling with it. So I had to get some really smart people, Susan Vitale and Amy Broman and Jim Tilsch and Joanne Katz, to say, okay, we can put a model to this overall process and say the average European-derived person with glaucoma has it for 15 years. And that was a number you needed to know, because if we're going to go to the public and go to Congress and say, we want to take care of everybody with glaucoma in the United States, you have to go armed with something. You have to go armed with real information or believable models or data from the Medicare database, as you and others are doing, so that we can then say, this is the real situation we're dealing with. These are the resources we need in order to decrease blindness. And I think that's what we all went into medicine to do. And becoming somebody interested in public health and larger scale issues leads into those sorts of questions. I think we're being challenged right now, as I'll talk about tomorrow, with a situation in which the country is saying we can't afford the health care we're giving. We need to cut your reimbursement. Medicare can't afford to pay all this money out to you doctors. And I think our response to that shouldn't be digging in our heels and saying, no, you can't cut our reimbursement. Our response should be to say, we can do as good or a better job and measure outcomes with patients and prove that what we're doing is an adequate or a job that does well for patients. And maybe in doing that, we're going to find that we are going to change how we're taking care of glaucoma, that we'll change how many times we see the patient, how many visual field tests we do. It may be more, it may be fewer, but it's time for us to really take a serious look at what we're doing and how we're doing it, and to judge that against scientific standards, against cost-effectiveness analyses. And there, once again, you need people who are interested in public policy and epidemiology to be able to answer those questions. And they have the most fundamental consequences for how many patients you're going to see next week when somebody as a glaucoma specialist goes to work, and how you see them. And it ought to be determined by science and by us and our patients, and not by somebody outside saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cut you 20% across the board. Right. That's silly. And we can't let that happen.
So where do you think, the future of glaucoma is? It's kind of you have the future of glaucoma research, but then you also have the future of glaucoma care in the United States and worldwide. And
we're teetering on the edge of coming very close to having a 24-hour in-the-eye pressure monitor. Mm-hmm. And when someone succeeds in doing that well in human eyes, we're going to understand for the first time a lot more about the relationship between pressure and the disease. And we are going to know which patients are suffering because of certain levels of pressure, because of fluctuation versus mean. Those questions are going to be questions that we actually can apply ourselves to. Imagine that with the present electronic possibilities, of course, we monitor someone's eye pressure, and they're supposed to be taking their medicine, which we're also monitoring electronically, and a central registry can call them on the phone or send them an email and say, for the last 4 days your pressure's been too high, and we notice that you haven't been using the Zalatan or whatever the drug bottle is that you're supposed to be using. Why don't we have a conversation between you and the doctor about how your glaucoma is going? And instead of seeing somebody every 3 months or every 6 months, we're going to be able to assist people on a regular basis and in real time with protecting their vision. I assume we'll be able to monitor their function both structurally and functionally in a better way. That's one thing we have to do. The second is that we have to move in the direction of therapies that are something other than eye pressure. And whether they are therapies that influence the rigidity of the sclera or the life of ganglion cells through a neuroprotective treatment to protect the ganglion cell, to increase its survival or decrease its death processes, we're just teetering on the edge of that. And I think within 5 to 10 years, we will be treating glaucoma patients in ways other than lowering the eye pressure. And we'll stop having to read every paper that starts with intraocular pressure lowering is the only thing we can do for glaucoma. Let's get rid of that.